Hi, you're listening to Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. I have had a chance, I've been so fortunate over the years to meet some really wonderful people involved in apologetics. And one of my favorites is Dr. Phil Fernandes. He's the founder and president of the Institute of Biblical Defense. And you can see a lot of his material on YouTube. So I've already done one podcast on a book of his called Hijacking the Historical Jesus, subtitled Answering Recent Attacks on the Jesus of the Bible. So wonderful chapters in here. But let me pick one for today. This is chapter 7, and he calls it Redating the New Testament Books. Now, he said it's kind of a shame that a lot of evangelical pastors accept the dates for the New Testament books that liberal New Testament critics come up with. But he says that shouldn't be the case. He said you can make a case for even earlier dates for some of the New Testament books. So that's what I'm looking at in this chapter. He actually goes through every book of the New Testament, and I'm not going to take the time to do that. I'm just going to do the Gospels and the book of Acts. He says liberal scholars, they're biased against miracles and traditional Christianity, and so they push the time period for the Gospels being written way out, as late as possible. And makes people wonder, well, that doesn't sound like it was done by eyewitnesses. They would have been all dead. And so it says evangelicals should question those liberal assumptions and take a second look at the dating of the New Testament books. He said there have been scholars, and he's going to give a few here, in the past and present who've speculated that the Gospels might have been written a whole lot earlier than liberal critics would allow. Now here's one. He's a New Testament scholar, John Robinson. He wrote a book, Redating the New Testament. He dated the whole New Testament before the destruction of the Jewish temple. That was 70 A.D. The entire New Testament. That's pretty neat. He said not a single New Testament book mentions the destruction of the temple, even though that was such a big deal to the Jews of that time period. It'd be like talking about American history in the last 30 or 40 years and not mentioning the towers coming down. Here's another one, William Albright. He's a leading archaeologist. He stated there's absolutely no good reason to date any of the New Testament books after about 80 A.D. In fact, here's what he says. This is a quote from Albright. In my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and the 80s of the first century. Then there's another scholar, John Wenham. He rejects those later dates as well. He said Matthew's gospel should be dated around 40 A.D. Now remember, Jesus is in the 30s, so we're talking about a very short period of time there. So date Matthew's gospel around 40, Mark around 45, Luke early 50s. And so those are some of the scholars who've really researched this thoroughly and will come up with these different dates. So what Phil is going to do in the chapter is look at evidence for the earliest possible dates of the New Testament books. He said it's obviously going to be tentative, but he said at least if you're going to be honest and do the scholarship, at least be open to the possibility of these early dates. So he's got a quote from a Yale scholar. He's an expert on Semitic languages. His name was Torrey. He said, I challenge my New Testament colleagues to designate even one passage from any of the four Gospels giving clear evidence of a date later than 50 A.D. He says the challenge was not met, nor will it be, for there's no such passage. So he said it's just the liberal anti-Christian assumptions that are preventing evangelicals from taking a second look and dating the New Testament books earlier than normal. So he said, why don't we take a look first at the Apostolic Fathers, and then it'll help us date the New Testament books. So the Apostolic Fathers were selected by the apostles for positions of leadership as the apostles grew older. They taught these people underneath them and had them go out and spread the word as well and write about it. So he said, take a look at some of their writings. So there's the Didache, right? It's called the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. Very, very early, right? It seems to be very primitive, and I won't go into all the reasons why. But the important part is it talks a lot about numerous New Testament passages. So one person dates the Didache from 40 to 60 A.D., but it's talking about Matthew and Luke, maybe even alluding to Hebrews and Acts and Mark. There's even a parallel passage with First John. So it does at least seem right in the ballpark with Matthew and Luke. And so we're talking 40 to 60 A.D. Well, you've got Clement of Rome. He wrote a letter late 90s, probably A.D., but in the epistle, he seems to talk about what Paul had to talk about years earlier, and he talks about church government that seems to be the pre-70 A.D. model, and he never appealed to his authority as Bishop of Rome. So Clement probably wrote this letter very early, didn't mention the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul. That was about 67 A.D., but he says the temple had yet to be destroyed. So Clement, okay, now again, what we're talking about here are these apostolic fathers. Try to date them, and then they referenced New Testament books, which means that they're even earlier. So as far as Clement, they're saying maybe 60s A.D., and he alludes to or quotes Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and some other books. You got the Shepherd of Hermas, right? So again, it's making a lot of references. It may be very early. Somebody says maybe 85 A.D., and it references Matthew and Mark and on and on. You've got Ignatius. You've got Polycarp, Papias, maybe it's Papias. You've got all these people in here, and they seem to be quoting from the Gospels earlier than them, and they're pretty early. He says, what about early fragments of the New Testament? They think they found some fragments back to the first century. There's a famous one called the John Ryland fragment. It's in John, that's part of John 18. And a lot of scholars say, it's in the 120s or 130s A.D., but there's one papyrologist who's really examined it carefully, and he says he sees that it has a lot of characteristics of first century documents. So it may be back into the 90s. And since that was found in Egypt, the original Gospel of John had to be written a lot earlier than that. So he said, if you look at the apostolic fathers and try to date them, of course, the New Testament books are going to be earlier. And so he said, let's take a look at the actual New Testament books. I'm just going to do the 4 Gospels. So he starts with the Gospel of Matthew. It says Jesus referred to the apostles as scribes in Matthew 13, which is interesting. That implies they took notes. And Matthew had been a tax collector, so he probably had to have decent writing skills. So maybe he was the stenographer for the 12 apostles. Now, I don't know if some of you are watching that show called The Chosen. They make a big point of that the Matthew in there is jotting down the things that Jesus is talking about. Papias is writing about 110 A.D. He says that Matthew was the first one to write his gospel out, and he wrote his gospel in Hebrews. And it says that makes sense that he'd be the first one because the original preaching of the gospel was trying to prove that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, and that's what you get in Matthew's gospel. A lot of Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus. And so the early church unanimously ascribed this gospel to Matthew. There wasn't any disagreement. Nobody said, it's somebody else. And Matthew, it's interesting that they would name the gospel after Matthew. Why would the early Christians do that? Because Matthew was a tax collector. Jews wouldn't have thought of that as a great person to write a book about Jesus. Seems like he would have been sort of a traitor. Some people date Matthew's gospel for about 40, others 45 to 50 A.D., and then there's some 40 to 60. But that's pretty early for the gospel. It's that's earlier than those later dates that the liberal New Testament critics come up with. It says conservative scholars are dating Matthew to the 30s and 40s. And a strong case, he said, is that James, let's jump ahead to James for just a minute here. James was probably written about 45 A.D., one of the earliest New Testament books, yet he knows Matthew's gospel. All right, so let's go through that again. I hope I'm not giving you too many dates here, but I think this is interesting. So James, they're dating it around 45 A.D., a very early book, and it knows the information there shows a knowledge of Matthew's gospel, especially the Sermon on the Mount. So if James is written around 45, that certainly moves Matthew's gospel earlier, doesn't it? It says a close study of the first 2 chapters of Matthew. Actually, a lot of people think that he interviewed Joseph before Joseph's death. It seems to be from Joseph's perspective. And it says in John 6:42, Joseph is spoken of as if he's still alive. So during Jesus' ministry, that's a possibility. That's interesting. Let's go to the Gospel of Mark. So there's no indication of the destruction of the temple in the Gospel of Mark, so probably before 70 A.D. That's when the temple was knocked down by the Romans. The early church fathers Papias and Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, they say that Mark got his material from Peter in his sermons. Since Mark wasn't one of the original apostles, why would the early church lie about him being the author? It's just like Matthew, right? Why would you name it Matthew? Why would you name it Mark? That wasn't one of the disciples. And it says after the death of Peter, Peter's gospel message wasn't lost because Mark had already recorded it. So it says the hypothesis that Mark wrote his gospel while Peter was still alive is consistent with what some of the church fathers say. So that puts it pretty early, doesn't it? So Mark is writing and Peter's still alive. Remember, Peter is alive until the mid-60s. So this may be pretty early. Let's go to the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. We're going to actually take them out of order, but you'll see why in just a second. Acts focuses on three characters there, Peter and Paul and James, right, the half-brother of Jesus, but does not record their deaths. And we know that Peter and Paul died somewhere in the mid-60s, and James died in the early 60s A.D., and Acts records people less important who have died, especially Stephen. So Acts must have been written before Peter and Paul and James were executed. Now, when was that? Well, mid-60s for Peter and Paul and probably early 60s for James. So that sounds like Acts was written before the early 60s. And there's no mention of the war with the Romans, no mention of the destruction of the temple. So that's confirmation Acts was written early. And it ends kind of oddly, doesn't it? As Phil points out, that kind of anticlimactically, he's got Paul sitting in Rome in chains, and that's it, right? We don't find out what happened to Paul. Well, that doesn't make any sense unless Acts was completed around 61. Now, Acts is a sequel. Now, how we back up a little bit here? So Acts is the sequel to Luke's gospel, so the Gospel of Luke had to be written even earlier. So both Luke and Acts were written before 62 A.D. And again, why would the early church make up the idea of Luke being the person that wrote the gospel? He was not one of the original apostles and probably never met Jesus. He says, if you look at the first two chapters of Luke's gospel, it seems to represent the perspective of Mary. Maybe he interviewed her. Wouldn't that be something? Can you imagine? People point to this woman and says that there she is, and he goes in, he sits down. This is the mother of Jesus who had a chance to watch him grow up. Wow, amazing. And then he gets to the Gospel of John, and we'll end the podcast on this. A lot of people say, oh, it's 2nd century, not even 1st century. Why? Because the way it shows Christ, it makes him so holy, and God, part of the Godhead, that was way too developed for the 1st century. But as Phil points out, if you look at Philippians and other Paul's letters, their Christology is really high too. I mean, Paul taught that Jesus was fully divine in his earliest letters. He refers to Jesus as the Lord Jesus Christ. You look at Philippians, what does Paul say there? Jesus continues to exist in nature as God, and every knee is going to bow to him. So the fact that John teaches the full deity of Christ and his pre-existence as part of the Godhead, that's not enough reason to reject a 1st century date for its composition. And then he comes up with a lot of reasons why you can trust it to be 1st century. He has a lot of church fathers quoted him. It says archaeological evidence. You've got that piece of that John Ryland's fragment of John 18 has been dated, and it may be within the 1st century. And it says, if you look, the author of John's gospel seems to be a Jew who had knowledge of Jewish feasts and customs, seems to be an eyewitness. And so you can judge that as pretty early too. And it said, so I think I'm wrapping up at this point. It says most conservative scholars are going to date John's gospel 85 to 95, but he said it may have been written earlier. So some people say it may be earlier than even the destruction of the temple, 70 A.D. Why? You look at John 5:2. Jesus speaks of the temple grounds in the present tense, like it's still standing. Well, the ones that argue for that late date say, well, it's the development of that theology. But again, as he says, Paul's theology is highly developed, even in his earliest letters in Galatians and 1 Thessalonians. And so Paul has his letters in the late 40s and early 50s. So it may be very, very early. It said the theology in John's gospel wouldn't be too advanced even for the mid-50s AD, right? Early to mid-50s. He said there are other good reasons to say John wrote his gospel before the temple got knocked down. The enemy of the church in his gospel is not the Roman Empire. It's the Jewish religious leaders. And there's no hint in the Gospel of John of any opposition to the church coming from the Roman Empire. But, Nero was persecuting the church like crazy in the 60s. But nothing like that shows up in the Gospel of John. All right. One other interesting thing here that I like that Phil has covered. He said, John's Gospel might explain why one of Jesus' greatest miracles, raising Lazarus from the dead, is not even covered in the first three Gospels. John tells the readers that the Jewish religious leaders of the time wanted to kill Lazarus because of his testimony. Well, why would Matthew, Mark, and Luke fail to mention this miracle? Here's a possibility. Lazarus was alive when they wrote their Gospels, and if they'd mentioned his name, that might have put his life in danger. So, whatever the case, as Phil wraps this up, he says John does seem to indicate the temple is still standing, looking at John 5:2. That makes a pre-70 AD date for that gospel. Interesting. As he wraps up the chapter, I'm going to go ahead here just real quickly. So again, he has a lot of information from the other books of the New Testament. I'm going to skip over. But as he wraps up, he said, the important thing to remember is not that these dates have to be embraced and held on to and, argued to the last breath. He said, what's important is this. Scholars should not assume the latest dates possible for each of the New Testament books. They ought to be open to accepting at least the earliest possible dates when they make more sense. And so I think that's a really good point that he's bringing up here. And at the end of the chapter, he's got a chart. Every New Testament book, the approximate date of composition, and the author. So he said we can't be dogmatic about some of these dates, but he said we should be, as students of the New Testament, we should be open to the earliest possible dates rather than just entertaining the latest ones. He says, we can't date the New Testament books with certainty, but he said he's hoping that by writing this book, it would at least encourage discussion and a re-examination of the dates for the composition of these books. So it's, people are making assumptions all the time. And he said the early dates of the New Testament books don't seem unreasonable as he wraps up the chapter. So again, this is called Hijacking, The Historical Jesus by Phil Fernandes. I should spell that for you just in case you're looking him up. It's Fernandes, not the letter Z, Fernandes, D-E-S. So Dr. Phil Fernandes. A lot of good books that he's put out, and a really interesting person, very nice individual. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast today, and I hope you're having a good day, and we'll do another podcast soon.